Arai Guma by Marc Yamaguchi. Chapter 2. Rachel Part 1. Rachel's head was bobbing with the sultry evening wind. Her dreams seemed to weave in exaggerated truths with surreal situations, since her father figured prominently in them. She could scarcely remember what he looked like, but the fights between her mother Rose and her shadowy father lived in her memory because they always ended the same way. She only remembered his haunches. He would exit the den first, as if in retreat, but the reality was he had to answer the call. Rose would tend to her siblings, who stirred with hunger while Rachel pretended to wake up for the same reason. Instinctively, she knew not to trouble her mother, especially after an argument with her father. Rose's agitation would be tinged with sadness and regret. She could not turn her husband. However, Rose was no navel-gazer, and she relied on the same energy that erupted in fights to organize her pups and ensure they stayed on the straight and narrow. It was never a chore to follow her mother. Rachel had been a model daughter and kept an eye on the youngest pups, Rory and Ralph, who could barely balance walking the fence lines. They constantly needed reminding of the dangers of crossing backyards, which was exhilarating for young boys trying to make a name for themselves. "Father will put us in the hunt ahead of Ricky and Ray," said Rory confidently. "When you trigger those walkies' nightlights, it's showtime," said Ray. "Yeah, you're like the main event," smirked Ricky. "Knock it off," hissed Rachel, which startled her mother, who was surveying the neighboring properties for signs of danger. Rachel knew Rory and Ralph were still impressionable, and being misled by their older brothers could cost them their lives. Rachel wondered when and how her father had been misled. She often caught her mother muttering something about her husband being misinformed as she returned to wake up her litter for evening excursions. In hushed tones, her mother would finish the conversation that her father had abandoned, and Rachel would lie dead still in order to gain perspective of their situation. It never occurred to Rachel her mother was talking quietly to herself to escape the loneliness. When the couple finally made the decision to migrate to the city, Rachel's father appeared to have made the right call for raising their family. The countryside was under assault by the giant yellow creepy crawlies that kept streaming in like a scourge upon their habitat. Predators and prey alike dropped their ancient feuds and ran for cover, if they could find cover. Rachel's father had rebuked his wife for wanting to wait out the storm of events that were rapidly changing their environment. He pointed out that the family never would have made it to safety without the help of a primeval foe. Unlike her parents, Rachel was born in the city. She was a precocious pup, but her life was nearly ended by a red-tailed hawk. Rachel's mother would have severely reprimanded her, but her father came to the defense of the predatory bird. In fact, this was the loudest shouting match between her parents Rachel could remember, since she was no longer the focus of that ensuing argument. That argument was firmly rooted in the past. About a month before the excavation and utter upheaval of the countryside, her father inadvertently scavenged in bushes too close to a tree with a hawk's nest. Her father was unaware until he was knocked over with a horrible burning sensation on the fleshy part of his back. The hawk's wings fluttered wildly before establishing a safe trajectory in which to land on a bough above and across from her father. Her father could hear the bird laughing and cajoled her father to come out into the clearing of the forest floor so that they could have a good look at each other. "Oh, come, Tubby, I can't lift you. I've tried," the hawk continued. "Kills have been far too easy of late. You are too good to be true." Her father had a bad wound from the hawk's talons, but he felt he was no longer in any danger. "Why are you talking to me, Hawk?" asked her father. "You and your kind would be better off moving far away from here," the hawk replied magnanimously. Her father wanted the hawk to elaborate, and he was keen to know why he should follow the advice of an enemy. Nowadays, children question their parents routinely, but Rachel's father was from the old world, in which kids had it beaten out of them to ask why things are the way they are. The hawk's feathers were no longer ruffled, and he continued, "You know, your kind has sustained generations of raptors, so I'd like to repay you this once. My relatives tell me I'm too smart for my own good. You may not have noticed they've all but left for the city." Rachel's father didn't follow, and hinted he had mouths to feed and would be moving on. The hawk suddenly swooped down to the ground within striking distance of Rachel's father, but this time he made sure to speak slowly, because it was common knowledge that raccoons had heads as dense as wood. "Beyond that growing perimeter of yellow caterpillars you've conveniently ignored," the hawk took pains to explain, "is the city, where the strongest and tallest gray trees grow." When Rachel's father first told Rose about this peculiar chat, Rachel's mother scoffed at the validity of a raptor imparting valuable information to a tree-hugging little bear. Since when did hawks and raccoons agree on anything, much less behave civilly towards one another? No raccoon had ever returned to speak of this city, so a trek to the city seemed like an elaborate trap set by predators to lure their prey out into the open. Besides, it was common knowledge that hawks' heads were full of air. Rachel's father lingered just long enough before the twitch of the hawk's eye would make good on its next meal. The hawk professed no love for the raccoon and pointed out quite bluntly, hawks saw fit to take lives to feed their basic needs. Raccoons, on the other hand, were sadly predisposed to be hoarders, and their figures were an understatement. It was why the hawk felt the city was a good fit for raccoons. Creatures there had a tendency to store things in structures that were hardened and impermeable and full of compartments. This hawk was the last to join his brethren afar in the tall gray trees, which provided the perfect vantage point to pluck tenderlings from their nests or dens. Hawks have a wicked sense of humor by nature, and he shared this macabre detail with this plump simpleton. "Raccoon, I tell you the truth, because it's enlightened self-interest to respect the hierarchy of the food chain. I let you go, and you propagate. Your children feed my children. It's rather elegant by design, don't you think?" Rachel's father thought the hawk was rather in love with the sound of his own voice, but before he could reply, the hawk lifted off as quickly as he had landed in front of him. The last words Rachel's father heard from the hawk was a fading and chilling shrill in the distance. "See you in the city, or you die." Rachel's father knew better than to impulsively bring news of this encounter to Rose. As he watched the hawk fly towards the horizon, Rachel's father began to think about the perimeter of yellow caterpillars that were located in the same direction. He had heard faint rumblings before, and thought he had felt the earth rhythmically shaking from time to time, but he had never made a connection with the onslaught at the hands of the clever creatures who stood upright on their hind legs. Rachel's father settled in to fish at a familiar stream, but he could scarcely concentrate on bringing home sustenance for his pregnant partner. Yellow caterpillars? Not only did Rachel's father scare away all the fish, but also he was startled at his own sudden exclamation. It was not until Rachel's father burst open the makeshift door of his and Rose's burrow did he mention for the first and last time the sight of the yellow caterpillars. At first, Rose picked up on something otherworldly from the smell of her husband's paws. He was too frantic to stop and spell out what he had witnessed. Rose thought she had heard him muttering the words yellow caterpillars, which seemed so odd and innocuous in the face of her husband's violent intrusion of their bucolic homestead.